Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida Department of Criminal Justice, and in this video I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about trauma and terrorism. What I'd like to do is to focus on cultural trauma, but also discuss individual trauma and the relationship between the two. So I'll start by citing Jeffrey Alexander's definition of cultural trauma, and this is from the book Cultural Trauma and Collective Identity, published in 2004 by University of California Press. And on page 1 in the chapter Toward a Theory of Cultural Trauma, Alexander states, to quote, "Cultural trauma occurs when members of a collectivity feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways." And so here we begin to start thinking about, in our case, terrorism and how terrorism attacks can affect communities and cultures. And we begin to ask questions such as, how do we address post-terrorist trauma? How do we repair a society that has produced terrorism? And how do we prevent further violence from occurring after terrorism ends? So, according to Alexander, we need to look at what happened, what groups of people were affected, how the victim group relates to larger audiences, and who were the perpetrators. So asking those questions to begin to understand the cultural traumatic effects. In the last chapter of the book, or the epilogue rather, Smelser has an article, September 11th, 2001, as Cultural Trauma. And he talks about different ingredients of traumatic events and looking at this. Some of those areas to look at in the culture would be shock, the shock that runs throughout communities that have experienced terrorism. Also, the disbelief and emotional numbing that may occur, and the collective mourning that we see. There's also the permanence of that trauma on the group, as well as national reactions to the terrorist attack, we might say. Also, the collective remembering and public interest in the events, and also identities that have been altered due to the trauma. And in thinking about trauma, and certainly this book has a lot of extremely useful material and some other chapters as well, but I started to think about, thinking about how people understand trauma, survive trauma, and survive terrorism, how they're related, and also thinking about how terrorism trauma is related to other traumatic experiences, whether it be being exposed to violence, being a crime victim, hurricanes, wildfires, and accidents, things of that nature, how this all relates to trauma. And one of the interesting features that came out in reading was that a lot of the material went back to the work of Ernest Becker, the anthropologist Ernest Becker. And when I started looking more at terror management theory as applied to terrorism, Becker came up as the one who really started terror management theory. And you can look at Ernest Becker's work. Articles are online. There is a Ernest Becker Foundation. There also are his books. And one of the surprising things to me was that I had read several of Ernest Becker's books back in my 1980s doctoral sociological theory courses, and I still have them. Here's his 1975 Escape from Evil, which I'll use today, and also The Denial of Death and the Structure of Evil. some very fascinating material. But looking at his 1975 publication, Escape from Evil, published by the Free Press, he starts talking about this whole idea that we have cultural symbols to reduce death anxiety and to increase feelings of having power. And that this fear of death is really what drives a lot of behavior. And you can, and I should also say, The Denial of Death. That's actually the title of one of his books. And that people in societies try to control nature while denying death. And that people will use power to increase their levels of self-esteem. And to quote Becker, on page 51, he states, "Men fashion unfreedom as a bribe for self-perpetuation. Men fashion unfreedom as a bribe for self-perpetuation." So he talks about how cultures address immortality, and some of the ways, for example, would be through having children, and or religion, and or state-focused strategies or techniques, or physical wealth, for example. And all this goes into repressing and denying death. So that really is probably the most important part of his work, is that death anxiety and everything that stems from that, on ways that people and cultures try to deal with that or address that. Sometimes we see scapegoating to reaffirm power, or we see that violence is perpetrated in a sense to purge evil and purify. On page 124, he states, "Each society is a hero system which promises victory over evil and death." And then on page 135, he states, regarding causes of evil, he states another cause of evil is, quote, "Man's hunger for righteous self-expansion and perpetuation." Let me see if I can get that right. Man's hunger for righteous self-expansion and perpetuation. In other words, societies create evil to destroy it. And this leads to terror management theory, and I posted a link on our website to Miller and Landau's 2005 article, "Communication and Terrorism, a Terror Management Perspective," and that's in Communication Research Reports, volume 22, pages 79 to 88. And Miller and Landau talk about terror management theory and about how it's based on Ernest Becker's work on the fear and denial of death. They talk about how we have a cultural worldview that provides us with meaning and also reduces anxiety. So there's cultural worldviews that help us understand how to interpret events, how to make sense of events, how to make sense of things, and also reduce our anxieties about daily living and our anxieties regarding death. Now, according to Miller and Landau, terrorists fear that their worldview will be destabilized, and therefore they need to scapegoat those that don't share their worldview to deal with those insecurities. And people may react to terrorism by trying to restore meaning, security, and justice. And that can occur in a variety of ways. Sometimes with violent activities as retribution. They also recommend that we take a close look at the use of symbolism, how hostility forms, how intergroup, or rather in-group cohesion increases during times of terrorist threat, and also how the mass media is utilized. So they really get us a lot of useful information there. And then moving a little bit now to the individual level, we do want to take a look at post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm not going to go over the diagnostic criteria and how a professional would make a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, but I do want to quote from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, published in 2013 by the American Psychiatric Association. I think an important component for us to look at as it relates to threat of terrorism or terrorist attacks or aftermath of terrorism, that post-traumatic stress disorder, one criteria, is the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. And they have a list of experiencing traumatic events or witnessing or learning about or repeated exposure. So someone can have post-traumatic stress disorder, can be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder if they were victimized in a situation. They could also be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder if they witnessed the traumatic event, and they could also be diagnosed if they heard about it and it created the post-traumatic stress response. And some of the symptoms, of course, would be distressing memories or avoidance behaviors or changes in mood or thought. And again, I'm not really going to get into the diagnosis, but some of the things we would look at would be the distress that occurs and re-experiencing the traumatic event, and numbing and avoidance, and also hyper-arousal. So we see some of those. Basically, basing that out of the DSM-5. This is just the pocket version of the DSM-5. The actual manual is much, much, much longer. But this is what the mental health professionals use to diagnose. And one of the things that I found interesting when I was preparing this presentation, I thought back, well, okay, what can I bring into it? What are some of the things that I'd want to talk about? And I went into my files, and something I had not looked at in years, and I almost found it by accident, but I had saved some magazines that came out right after 9/11, and looked through them, and really was kind of surprised that, of course, it brings back memories of that event, but I was surprised at the graphic details of the photographs in the magazines. I'm not going to show those or anything, but this is the Time magazine one that came out 9/11, September 11, 2001. It says there's the front, if you can see, and then there's the back. And then this is Newsweek, September 24th, 2001, special report, Newsweek. And it says, "After the Terror, God Bless America." And you can see the cover there. And, looking through here, it really just was very surprising that, I guess, seeing it back then in September of 2001, and then probably saw it there several months after, and then putting it aside for a number of years and looking at it again, different, having a different perspective with time going by. But I thought that was interesting to take a look at from a historical perspective, and then thinking about how this relates to trauma, cultural trauma, and memory and traumatic stress. I'm not going to go over the research on the effects of traumatic stress on the brain and the body, nor am I going to focus on treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder at all. But what I did want to mention before I wrap up this video is that dealing with evil can be hazardous to your health, both physical and psychological. And one of the things that I did years ago is I started incorporating into my classes, I think it started when I was teaching a sex crimes course, sections on exposure to traumatic events and secondary traumatic stress, or vicarious trauma, if you will. And I thought it was important to provide the information just at a basic level to especially my undergraduate students who are just starting their careers in maybe law enforcement or some type of area like that. Nevertheless, where they're going to be exposed to traumatic events or people who have been survivors of traumatic situations or events. And so I started to incorporate that, and then I made some videos which I've had up for a number of years now that I just link in my classes. They're on YouTube, on post-traumatic stress disorder, on secondary traumatic stress, on vicarious trauma, and a book I published with a clinical psychologist a number of years ago. We have a chapter on burnout and vicarious trauma in the child abuse and neglect field. And so I think it's an important area, and certainly researchers who study traumatic events, we would need to understand the effects that can have as well. And I've done some workshops a while back on the effects of exposure to evil, if you will, or traumatic events. And so that I think is an important area as well. I know I had bias going into my own work of teaching and research in thinking about, because I spent a number of years working on sex crimes and seeing the devastation that had occurred to families and individuals, survivors of horrific crimes, and also on a child abuse unit seeing some horrific cases. When I went into teaching and research, that was not as distressing, for example, as working in the actual field was. But it didn't help me to think about how, researching and teaching could also be very important and something I would have to recognize as well. So certainly that's something to take a closer look at and to be aware of working in disaster management. If you're working in emergency management, I would hope somewhere along the line you would get some information on vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress for your own safety and for your own knowledge. And let me go ahead and wrap up this video here. Thank you.